The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. While some people were speaking about how the temple was adorned with costly stones and votive offerings, Jesus said, "All that you see here, the days will come when there will not be left a stone upon another stone that will not be thrown down." And then they asked him, "Teacher, when will this happen? And what sign will there be when all these things are about to happen?" And he answered, "See that you not be deceived. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and 'the time has come.' Do not follow them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for such things must happen. But it will not immediately be the end." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be powerful earthquakes, famines, and plagues from place to place. And awesome sights and mighty signs will come from the sky. Before all this happens, however, they will seize and persecute you. They will hand you over to the synagogues and to the prisons, and they will have you led before kings and governors because of my name. It will lead to your giving testimony. Remember, you are not to prepare your defense beforehand, for I myself shall give you a wisdom in speaking, that all your adversaries will be powerless to resist or refute. You will even be handed over by parents, brothers, relatives, and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head will be destroyed. By your perseverance, you will secure your lives." The Gospel of the Lord. Well, we are approaching the end of the year. I'm not talking about the calendar year. I'm talking about the liturgical year. Next Sunday is the Feast of Christ the King. And the following Sunday is the first Sunday of Advent, which is the start of the new liturgical year. And as you know, we are on a cycle of 3 years of readings, of the Sunday readings. And this year we've been hearing mostly during the course of the year from Luke. Next year it will be Matthew. Now I want to point out that there are differences between Matthew and Luke. They're relatively subtle, but nonetheless they're real. For example, the passage that I just read is not found in Matthew. Luke gets it from Mark. Now, Matthew gets a lot of stuff from Mark, too. As a matter of fact, Matthew and Luke together, you can reproduce Mark pretty much. But they each have their own particular point of view. They each have their own understanding. They're addressing specific questions that come from specific congregations, from specific gatherings of Christians. The testimony and the story in this particular reading from Luke is about the end times. Now, Luke, which I say, Matthew does not have this narrative. He does have narratives about the end times. I suggest that you look at chapter 25, for example, but it's not the same material. It's different. What Luke here borrows from Mark is also a little bit different from what Mark writes. Now, we have to understand, again, this is 2,000 years ago. The first Christians, by and large, and we find this in Paul too, were convinced that the end of time was at hand. It was going to happen, and it was going to happen soon. For Mark, it was especially prominent because the destruction of Jerusalem had pretty much just taken place when his gospel was written, around 70 of the first century. Luke was writing some 15 or so years later, and things didn't really seem to have changed that much. People were asking, well, wait a minute, why is it taking so long? So you'll notice if you compare Mark 13 with this passage in chapter 21 of Luke, you'll notice some differences where Luke kind of gives Jesus words to which he is saying, slow down. What are the signs that all these things are about to happen? He tells you that some people will say this and one thing or another. Don't follow them. Don't sweat that. You'll hear of wars and insurrections. But that does not mean the end. Okay? So he's given people, rethink this. Paul does that actually in his own letters. We can see a trajectory. In his earliest letters, he seems to be convinced that the end is near. By the end of his own life, he begins to have some doubts and concerns about that. Doesn't seem to be happening. The point I want to make is most specifically from the first reading. Now you'll notice the first reading and the third reading, which is characteristic of the lectionary, by the way, for most Sundays and holy days where you have three readings, the first reading and the third reading are directly related. They have similar thematic material. The second reading basically is thrown in as a way of giving the homilist, in case he just strikes out constantly on the first and third reading, he's at least got something else that might give him some ideas. Okay? The first reading is from the book of the prophet Malachi. Now, Malachi is dealing with thematic material very similar to what Luke is dealing with in the gospel reading today. Essentially the end times. Now, Malachi, the book it's very short. It's only 3 chapters long. It's the very last book in the Old Testament. Malachi is one of the 12 what's called minor prophets, as opposed to the 4 major prophets. And Malachi is a very angry person. Now, there's a lot of problems historically with Malachi because, first of all, his name doesn't seem to actually be a name. It's much closer to a Hebrew phrase, which means my messenger. Doesn't sound like a name, it sounds like a title. As a matter of fact, nobody in history before Malachi is ever found named Malachi. Okay? The name only becomes very popular in later centuries, especially in the post-Christian era, among Jews and Christians as a name. But Malachi doesn't seem to be a name, it seems to be a title, my messenger, which would be a good title, say, for a prophet of the Lord, okay? Which in effect he claims to be. Another thing about Malachi is we're not sure what he does. He's not real good with specifics. With some of the great prophets, and even most of the minor ones, there are specific things that you can find in the documents that place them in a relatively specific place in history. That's certainly true of the major prophets. But Malachi, it's hard to tell. Now, most scholars, the consensus, if you will, is that Malachi, whoever he was writing or at least preaching during the period of reconstruction after the Babylonian captivity. Okay? Now, again, in prophecy, for example, we have the book of Isaiah, 65, 66 chapters. But the book of Isaiah is actually composed by 3 authors over a period of almost 200 years. Chapters 1 to 39 came undoubtedly from Isaiah, the original prophet. Isaiah predicted the destruction of the kingdom of Judea. Now, he predicted it not in a horoscope kind of way, having trances and so forth. He made it was almost a political kind of prediction. He looked at the circumstances of the world around him and he came to a conclusion. Isaiah lived at a time when Judea was still in existence, when it was still an independent country. Over to the north and to the east, you had the Assyrian Empire, which had destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. Okay, the Jewish communities had broken into 2 separate kingdoms, southern kingdom of Judea, the northern kingdom of Israel. Assyria rose up and they destroyed the northern kingdom. It didn't exist anymore. They did not destroy Judea, but they threatened it. and the Judeans had to pay tribute to the Assyrians. Tribute meaning money. Okay? In the meantime, the Babylonians were growing in power and wealth and strength, and eventually they overthrew the Assyrian Empire. They then threatened Judea. Now, this is what was going on in Isaiah's time, and so Isaiah is saying, look, why is this happening to us? The northern kingdom gets destroyed and overthrown, and now we're being threatened with why? He said, well, I'll tell you why. Because we are violating our covenant. We made a covenant with Yahweh, a covenant that goes all the way back to Abraham, the patriarch, and we're not abiding by it. That covenant involved giving honor to Yahweh, in the temple and in the local worshiping communities, and to take care of one another. We're not doing that. Those who have the power and the wealth to do so are lording it over those who don't. The sick are not taken care of. The lost are not found. The sick or the lonely are not comforted. The poor are made even poorer. It says we can't do that. That's a direct violation of our covenant. And there are consequences built into violating the covenant. Well, it happened. The Babylonians eventually came in, captured Judea, destroyed the temple, and took many of the leading families back to Babylon, hence the Babylonian captivity. Judea itself began to fall apart politically, socially, economically for the people who remained behind, and it was a time of great mourning. How can we sing the praises of Yahweh by the waters of Babylon? Well, during that time of exile, another prophet who identified, probably was of the school of Isaiah, comes along and writes a series of prophecies. They're not prophecies so much as simply saying, see, told you so, all right? Or at least the guy who I've inherited the mantle of. And he's saying if we want to correct this, then we have to take seriously the fact that we are violating the covenant we made with Yahweh. Okay? Time passes. The Persian Empire begins to grow in power. It eventually overthrows and destroys the Babylonian Empire. And the Persians, for reasons of their own, political and social and economic reasons, decide that it is to their advantage if there is a stable situation in that part of Palestine, which is Judea, okay? The area around what is the city of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem was essentially a ghost town, but the Persians said, look, we're going to send many of these folks back. They're going to come in and they're going to have wealth, money from us, and we're going to use it to rebuild the city, to re-equip people who are working in the fields, and especially the single most important institution in the Judaist culture was the temple. We will rebuild the temple, okay? Solomon's temple. And many of those folks said, oh, well, that sounds like a good deal. So they go back. But there's this, as this is happening, there's a third guy who rises up, who takes the mantle of Isaiah and says, okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's not forget how all of this trouble arose in the first place. The first guy told us, the second guy reminded us, and now I'm telling you, stick to it. Don't forget. Well, they forgot. That's what Malachi is complaining about. Malachi, as I say, the general consensus is that it was somewhere a period of about 50 to 100 years after the Persians had begun the process of rebuilding the city of Jerusalem, and the same old thing was happening. Those with power were using it to their advantage. Those who had none or little were taken advantage of. The sick were untended. The lonely were kept alone. The isolated, the poor, the hungry were not taken care of. This is what, and now listen what Malachi said. As a matter of fact, I would recommend that you go back. Chapter 3 is really a powerful chapter 3 of Malachi, but just what we have here. Lo, the day is coming, blazing like an oven, when all the proud and all evildoers will be stubble, and the day that is coming will set them on fire, leaving them neither root nor branch. Does this sound like a happy guy? No. He is really angry. He's saying, when will we ever learn? Right? We're doing the same thing that got us in trouble in the first place. And we expect, what's the old saying? Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Okay. We're doing the same thing, but we're going to get the same load laid against us. He's angry. We see a little bit of that in the language that Luke puts in Jesus' mouth in the Gospels. But it's also important to understand there's a phenomenon here that is universal, that is not particular to the Jewish people or to Christians or the Judaic-Christian tradition or anything, that is characteristic of humanity. Throughout human history, at least since writing has been invented, scholars have noticed that in cultures where there are large populations of oppressed people and small but powerful populations of oppressors, that the oppressed people find their own language. They write their own songs and tell their own stories and write their own poems. And those poems often involve an apocalyptic world that turns upside down. In other words, we're on the bottom now, but someday we're going to be on the top. And you're going to be on the bottom, and you're going to be really sorry. That's apocalyptic thinking. And it's found in almost all cultures. And in all times, at least I say as after, if they didn't write it down, we have no way of knowing. But it seems to be a universal human phenomenon. People who consider themselves oppressed get angry and tell stories in which the situation is reversed, and they're going to take care of those who oppress them. Okay? We find it in this culture. Any of you are familiar with the ghost dance of the late 19th century, the Native American groups in the upper Midwest and the Great Basin and that part of the United States formed a cult. It organized somewhere in probably in western Utah, but whatever. It spread through that region. It was called the ghost dance because they believed that by performing a specific ritual act, that eventually what would happen is God would get rid of all of us who were of European origin. We would just disappear from the earth. The buffalo, which by the time the ghost dance became prominent among the Native Americans, was almost extinct, despite the fact that it was the single most important animal for them in their cultures, that the buffalo would come back. And things would be the way they used to be. The people who had original control of that territory would have it again. And the rest of us who had taken it from them would be punished. Okay? Well, obviously it didn't happen. As a matter of fact, the massacre at Wounded Knee was a direct result of that particular practice. But there it was, as we find constantly throughout human history. The people who are oppressed don't like it, and it makes them angry. Okay? There is a problem, however, with this kind of apocalyptic thing. By the way, I was just, when I was putting this together, I was trying to think of some more recent examples, and I thought of Bob Dylan. Those of us of a certain age may remember about 1962, 63, there was a song that was very popular called The Times They Are Changing. I went back to that song. I have the CDs, and sure enough, at the beginning, in one of the early verses, it says, "For the loser now will be later to win." And then toward the end, he has a line which talks about the slow one now will later be fast. And at the final stanza, as the present now will later be past, The order is rapidly changing, is rapidly fading. And the first one now will later be last. So you have on the one hand, the loser now will be later to win, but you have at the last one, the winner now will later be not the loser. That's apocalyptic. That's apocalyptic thinking. Okay? We find it everywhere. The problem with it is it's vengeful. It's mean. It's cruel. It's violent. It's bloody. The book of Revelations, which is Malachi is the last book in the Old Testament. Revelations is the last book in the entire Bible. And the book of those of us, again, of a certain age may remember the time when the book of Revelations was referred to as the Apocalypse. That was characteristic of how Catholics in that era named that last book. It was the Apocalypse. Okay? And that was an accurate statement. As a matter of fact, in some ways, more accurate than the book of Revelations, because it is really a nasty book. It's a weird book, and it's probably the single most abused book in entire Scripture by people who use it with absolutely no understanding of its context. But nonetheless, it is a nasty book. You have the four horsemen who wreak unspeakable devastation on earth at God's order. It's a nasty, nasty book. Those who are saved are glorious. Those from whom they are saved are essentially tortured and slaughtered. It's not a good book in that respect. And in the early church, as the early Christians were trying to make decisions about what books should be canonized, that is, what books belong together as the basic documents of Christianity, many of the early church fathers said, do not include the book of Revelations because it's so horrible. It's so mean-spirited. How can you justify this kind of an attitude when we are ones proclaiming the Prince of Peace, the Lord who reveals to the world a God who is loving, compassionate, and forgiving? It's inconsistent. And essentially what happened, of course, was the circumstances changed and people began to see in the book of Revelation some positive elements to it. One of the things that it celebrates is courage, of stick-to-itiveness, of perseverance, of mutual and loving support, which overcame the very negative elements of it. And so the book was accepted. But you can see this is a problem. How can we reconcile vengeance, destructive, violent vengeance, with a loving, forgiving God? Well, we can't. We're dealing with human beings. It's just the thing. If somebody treats you unfairly, it makes you angry. If it doesn't make you angry, either you're not paying attention or you're really dense, or you have reached a level of sanctity far beyond the rest of us. Anger is provoked by injustice. Okay? That's simply a fact. So the question is not, how do we not feel that way? The question is, what do we do about the fact that we do feel that way? And that we should understand that people who are there's nobody in this room has suffered a level of oppression like many, many people on the planet have. Okay? But we've all experienced it. Okay? If we can put ourselves in the place of others who have suffered far more than we have, then that's the point. It's not telling us to deny our humanity, to feel differently. You can't tell somebody, don't feel bad, if they feel bad. It's ridiculous. It's like telling somebody who's 7 foot tall, stop being tall. It's just, feelings, as I was mentioning to Marcus earlier, a friend of mine used to say, feelings are infallible. They are what they are. Okay? The question is not what you feel, the question is what you do with your feelings. And in that case, Malachi gives some good advice. Luke gives some great advice. This is a big issue with Luke. You find it in Matthew and Mark and throughout the letters of Paul. Take care of one another. The Old Testament, the prophets were upset because part of the covenant with Yahweh was to take care of one another, and people weren't doing it. They were taking care of themselves at the cost of others. So that's what we're talking about here. We're coming to the end of the year, and the last thing that we find before the proclamation of Jesus as the King is what the ending means. And it means we are responsible for it. We are called upon to take care of one another. That's what we need to do the best we can. We're never going to be perfect. But the point is to make the effort, to try. We can't completely change the world and make it the way God wants it to look like. But you know what? We can make tomorrow a little bit better than yesterday.